This is Risky Women Radio, a show that connects, celebrates and champions women in risk, regulation and compliance. We're here to share the insights on the biggest issues in our industry and hear inspiring journeys from our global members. Sign up to our newsletter at riskywomen.org. I'm Kimberly Kroll, your Chief Risky Woman. Welcome to Risky Women Radio. Today's Risky Woman is Zoë Newman. Zoë is the Regional Managing Director and the Global Co-Head of the Financial Investigations Practice at Kroll, and she is based in London. Zoë leverages over 20 years of experience working across Eastern Europe, Central Asia and the Middle East, and has numerous international cross-border investigations. These investigations required the tracing of complex fund flows, dissection of corporate structures, and the assessment of the integrity of transactions to support both civil and criminal asset recovery proceedings and disclosures to regulators. So it's a fascinating area, but before we get stuck into understanding a bit more on the evolving nature of corporate fraud, welcome, Zoë.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
Great to have you. And I would like actually to hear a bit more about your career journey, because I think it's one of the things that people really enjoy about the podcast is hearing all these different ways that people have sort of navigated their way through or found their way into their role and what those highlights have been along the way.
So my career journey is quite a simple one because I have unusually spent all my working life at Kroll.
Excellent.
Yeah. In the very old school way, I applied via an ad in the Financial Times 25 years ago, and here I am now. So the Kroll I joined 25 years ago was much more of an intelligence-focused firm, where we dealt obviously in investigations, but very much leveraging external, hard-to-find information for companies. And I joined as an analyst doing that investigative research work, loved it. Didn't realise you could do this sort of work in the private sector, and then have worked my way through. I did economics and law at university. When I was a sort of junior case manager in my late 20s, I realised that sort of the rebirth of the FCPA, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, was coming to fruition again and a lot more enforcement. And I realised the importance of having a financial qualification. So trained as an accountant, very much a forensic investigative accountant as opposed to a books and records balance sheet management accountant. And that was really timely because it was at the same time that Kroll's work evolved much more into the internal as well as the external world of investigations. So as a result, a lot of my experience over the sort of past 15 or so years has been working on internal investigations in relation to corruption, fraud, money laundering. And the reason why I've enjoyed it so much is we're very heavily emerging, developing market focused. So a lot of the work that I do tends to be in jurisdictions where you wouldn't necessarily go to in your normal course of holidaying. So I've met some fascinating people and clients in those jurisdictions. And here I still am today. So must be doing something right.
Fantastic. And so your role now, you're the Regional Managing Director and the Global Co-Head of the Financial Investigations Practice. And tell us more about your role, and I guess you're running an entire team.
Sure. So I look after, we have 4 regions, as you'd expect. I look after Europe, Middle East and Africa. So my role is very much around running those teams and the different offices, which are more than capable individuals in them, but making sure that we're cohesively connected from a go-to-market perspective. Where our big differentiator is where our people are physically located is not necessarily reflective of where we do our work. So, as I said, we're very emerging, developing market focused. So we coordinate a lot of our work around the driving of business development and client-related activity in Eastern Europe, Central Asia, Africa, and work very cohesively as a region in various initiatives. So at the moment, we are seeing a big growth in the gaming sector. So we're working cross-border across that. We're increasingly doing a lot more around family offices and helping them with the issues that they face because they tend to be further down the governance and compliance curve in terms of maturity. So a lot of my work is around knitting everybody together and making sure that we have an EMEA strategy, not an office specific strategy. And then, I love casework. and would hate to stop doing casework and only focus on management. So from the financial investigations side, a lot of our work is on big ticket, high profile investigations where I still sort of roll my sleeves up and provide very much of the strategic input into approach, the client advice around those financial investigations.
Really interesting. And obviously, a lot of these challenges are really, really important to firms and the customers that you deal with. How do you create impact in your role?
A former colleague once said to me a long time ago, a lot of our role is common sense based on common experience. And I think that was particularly true when I was younger, because I joined the firm at a very young age. I became quite senior at what felt like a young age. And it's quite difficult sometimes, particularly as a female, when you're talking to, ministers in jurisdictions or CEOs or chairmen, to think, well, how are they going to take me seriously? And I always remember that piece of advice, because actually, when there's a big fraud or when there's a whistleblower alleging corruption or we've stolen your data or we've got a team walking out of a firm and they're taking all of it with us, we sort of instinctively know what to do because it's our everyday. And you forget sometimes that that's not obvious. To me, it feels obvious what the next step should be. But I think we see nowadays with lots of the big headlines around the different things nowadays that impact corporates, that there's always been fraud, corruption's become a much more important issue, obviously, but the whole Me Too movement, allegations of bullying, harassment, that can really impact the reputation of corporates, and just big scale frauds and the panic that can ensue amongst management and the missteps that they can make at the outset. So I think a lot of our role is to be the calm one and provide guidance, but also to be able to provide clients with insight in markets that they are not comfortable with. I mean, I'm not a linguist, unfortunately. I wish I was. But the majority of my colleagues speak multiple languages. They're regional specialists, and you cannot go in as a Western corporate into a lot of jurisdictions with your eyes wide shut. You'll come unstuck straight away and not understand the nuances of how you investigate legally in those jurisdictions. So also a lot of our work is around advice and hand-holding in markets where they're less comfortable. But I would also say a big change over the past 7 to 10 years, but more the past 5 to 7, is the growth of compliance. It used to be really hard to proactively get clients engaged on the importance of compliance. I think, obviously, in the financial services sector, it's a different story, but corporate compliance, to get firms to proactively conduct a fraud risk assessment, bribery and corruption sanctions risk assessment, almost impossible. Now that's completely changed. And I think what we're seeing as well is a lot of the big conglomerates working in emerging developing markets who are wanting to transact with the US, elsewhere. They're also realizing that they need to have such systems in place. So a lot of it, again, is hand-holding those clients in what's necessary and how to implement such a compliance program. I do think as well, with the Russia-Ukraine war, sanctions used to not be something that corporates worried about beyond a quick and dirty world check. Now there's so much attention paid to sanctions and proactive awareness of what corporates do and don't know and what they need to do to remediate deficiencies in the sanctions space. That's completely changed compared to it always used to be in the sphere of financial services.
So I think we'll come on to some of those topics a bit more in terms of what are those trends, what are the things that corporates should be looking at. But I guess it's interesting. We ask a lot of participants what's the biggest risks that they've taken in their career. And a lot of them are saying, oh, well, I left this firm and I joined another one, or I changed countries or whatever. What's the biggest risk that you think you've taken?
Staying put, probably. There's lots of opportunities that come to us in our careers. And one piece of advice I always say to people in the team is you should always go and have the conversation. It does no harm whatsoever. But sometimes it has the benefit of you realizing that the grass isn't greener and you realizing that actually you're in a pretty good space where you are. Everybody has bumps along the road, but actually the few occasions when I've come close to the line, I'm always very glad with hindsight that I've stayed, because having fun in what we do is key, because it can be pressured, it can be stressful. You don't ever really switch off apart from on maternity leave. I think that was my one time I had holidays where I wasn't concerned about my emails, because you've got to be available. And sometimes that can be tiring, particularly as you go through your life and the different stages of it. Traveling each and every week was amazing fun in my 20s, not so much by the time I was in my late 30s and 40s now. But the work that we do and the people that I do that work with have always kept me at the firm. And I think also the firm has evolved completely into a big professional services organisation that is known as a specialist in what it does. So I would say lots of people have questioned me over the years, why have you stayed? Oh, you really ought to go here, there and everywhere. Whereas actually it's paid off. You know, sometimes being loyal pays off and sometimes sort of believing in the people around you. But I think a lot of that, again, has to do with trust. And I've learned that a lot myself. Trust and loyalty have meant a lot to me in my colleagues. And therefore, it's important that you invoke that in the team around you at the same time.
I agree. As someone that stayed at Thomson Reuters for 28 and a half years, I consider myself a fairly loyal a loyal person. And I met many of the team, or maybe just a little subset of the team the other week. And you've obviously got such a breadth of different skills and knowledge across so many different areas that makes it fascinating as well. So really interesting, all of the different people there who could talk to cyber, and we were having conversations about crypto and AI, and, you've got so many different dimensions that obviously your customers are interested in, but obviously the firm has specialists in, which I thought was fantastic. And one more just career question, but what's the kind of light bulb moment or something that you feel's really shaped your careers? Because you've talked that you're really passionate about the casework and bringing together different skills. Is there something else that was sort of that light bulb moment?
If I can answer that question at a very basic level, the absolutely honest Zoe answer is not being frightened to ask a dumb question, because we have to be parachuted in to companies that operate in sectors that, frankly, I didn't even know existed at the time that we arrive. But people often ask me the question, what are your sector specialisms? How do you work across sectors at Kroll? Actually, in investigations, we very deliberately don't, because our job as fraud specialists, corruption specialists, sanction evasion specialists is to be able to look helicopter-wise at an organisation and think, put yourselves in the shoes of a wrongdoer and figure, if I was them, what are the weaknesses that I would manipulate to commit fraud or corruption? But you're only going to be able to do that if you can very quickly understand the business that you're operating in. And I've seen over the years people nod and say yes, yes, yes. And my mum always taught me, there is no dumb question. And if you ask the dumb question, you'll realise how many other people weren't aware of the answer. And the moment I stopped being worried about looking stupid and just said, maybe it's me, and realised nobody's going to be cross with you. Nobody's going to think you're an idiot. It's perfectly fine. And actually, you can massage egos quite a lot by admitting to people that what they do is complicated and that you need some help understanding it. So that was a light bulb moment for me. It gave me confidence, particularly because you need to be confident, because we're on site a lot of the time in quite difficult situations. You can't faff and leave and have not really understood what the issue is.
No, I think that's really great learning then that everyone should take away.
I wish I had a more scientific point to make.
No, I think that's perfect. This episode is brought to you by Kroll. Stay ahead with Kroll. As the leading independent provider of financial and risk advisory solutions, Kroll leverages their unique insights, data, and technology to help clients stay ahead of complex demands. Let's get into the evolving nature of corporate fraud, because obviously it's a big space. So You've sort of started to talk a little bit about this, but how are you seeing the nature of corporate fraud evolve? So you mentioned compliance, for example, but obviously we've now got more technology. Criminal networks are really targeting employees of global corporates, where we've seen other ways where they're getting in, and the employees are becoming almost unwitting co-conspirators in some kinds of fraud, etc. So how are you seeing the corporate fraud evolve, and how is that looking?
We always used to talk about the insider threat in corporate fraud, and that still happens. Of course it does. And for practically all of 2021 and 2022, all anybody asked was, when's the big fraud wave going to come as a result of COVID? And the answer is some of that is coming now, particularly around deals where perhaps misrepresentations were made at the point when people couldn't really get into companies and deals were taking place. So the insider threat is still there, but it's not there to the same magnitude as what I would call the external threat, and that is organised crime. And what we've seen, I mean, frankly, it started 10 years ago, and it's, in terms of a curve, gone vertical very quickly. That is in the sense of organised crime has become so organised, it behaves like the nimblest, most AI-driven, tech-driven company out there, and it is targeting corporates in their thousands day after day after day after day all around the world, and they only need a 1% success rate, and they're all billionaires. You know, just within the Kroll sphere, we have easily seen $1 billion stolen out of companies through organised crime. And some of that is cyber attacks, you know, we've all read about in the papers and are ongoing at the moment. But an amazing amount of it is good old social engineering of foreign subsidiaries of international corporates, where the head of finance in that foreign subsidiary answers the phone to the CEO, joins a video call with who they think is the CEO or someone similar at corporate level. And again, you know, humans are always the weakest link, no matter what controls are put in place. And these guys or gals are frankly so clever in that now we're seeing really the use of AI to imitate voices of CEOs. So it feels like they're speaking to them. In the old days, it used to be just if you were Danish, not picking on the Danes, but and you were speaking to your Chicago-based CEO, you wouldn't notice that the accent wasn't quite right in the same way. Now it sounds like the CEO, or even there's a video of the CEO on the video call, but it's not, you know, these deep fakes. Their egos are massaged and they're convinced to wire millions and millions and millions outside of organizations, either because it's a very confidential deal, either because there's some big tax liability that's got to be paid. And then often our clients, when they phone in a panic, suspect that the individuals that have made the transfers have to be complicit because they can't believe they've been that quote unquote stupid. But I think what's constantly underestimated is how clever the social engineering is. So they've done all the research on the individuals. They are able to reference working hours. They're able to reference where they live and their family. So it all adds up. And then, you know, they're put in touch with corporate lawyers at big, well-known law firms, but, you know, they don't notice that there's a dash between the net, you know, on the web address and similar. And then the money's transferred and it is laundered so quickly, like so quickly across the world. It's so hard for companies to get it back. I mean, if they move quickly and fast, then we can get it back, but many don't. And so that to me is the biggest change in terms of the evolving nature of corporate fraud. I think in companies now, maybe moving on to a question you haven't asked me, but companies now are being much more savvy at using their financial data to spot anomalies in terms of why are we suddenly wiring tens of millions out of our Thailand operation.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Like, what's the practical advice, I guess, that you give? Because you've got AI as well as the social engineering all now coming full on to a lot of these organizations.
I think organisations have to be much better, and I still don't think many have got this right, much, much better about how they're training their employees and to always question authority, which culturally doesn't come naturally in a number of jurisdictions. So I think there needs to really be an adjustment as to how employees are being advised as to the latest frauds and how they're being committed. We've all tried to race through corporate training as quickly as possible. I'm not sure that works. In the case of being alert to fraud, I think there needs to be better real life examples given, and maybe it needs to be not classroom based, but needs to be in person based. Just 2 weeks ago, I got a WhatsApp from our CEO saying, "Hey, Zoe, give me a call." At first, I thought, "Oh, what does he want?" Because, don't have an ego enough to think that he needs to call me very often. But it was when I spotted that his picture was our corporate picture, I thought, hang on a second. And then I checked the mobile number against our system and realised it was wrong. That's just one example. But, my job, our job, is to be naturally suspicious, and lots of people's isn't.
I mean, I think it's interesting on the training point, because I actually think the training that we had recently at my company was very good. And a lot of these things you need to keep in mind as a private individual as well. I mean, of course, most of us probably don't have billions that we're going to transfer to somebody. But, the amount that we could end up sending to the wrong, or putting in your credit card details when it's a fake link, or all of those things can have big repercussions. And the training now is saying, check the email address. Is that legitimate? Check all of these other details. Hopefully people take it a little more seriously because there's personal benefit.
Completely agree. So I think training is one area, encouraging always questioning and people being called out for good behaviour in that regard. But then we say humans, all the wrongdoers rely on is one weak link. And as I say, they're probably targeting 1,000 at the same time. So I do think where companies fall behind is not monitoring their data effectively. If they spot it within 24 hours, you've got a chance of getting it back. If you spot it 2-3 months later, and actually that's where big corporates are the weakest, because they might operate cash pooling. It takes a while for the information to channel up, whereas a small medium enterprise is going to notice if 6-7 million suddenly gone out of its bank account, whereas your big corporates aren't necessarily going to.
Yeah, so the key then is really monitoring your data, having some good training. Any other ways to minimize losses that you recommend?
I mean, I've talked a lot about the external threat. Going back to sort of the internal threat, again, we're seeing much more corporate buy-in to fraud risk assessment and understanding where their weaknesses are within their organisation. You tend to see great big glossy headquarters, but then the subsidiary that was acquired 7 years ago in Nigeria hasn't had its systems integrated in any way, shape or form. So I think proactively understanding the fraud risks that you face as a corporate, once controls are necessary in certain either business units or jurisdictions, will also help at the same time. So definitely sort of a lot of firms just aren't aware of the risks to them, or have done it 5 years ago and not allowed for the changing nature of how the business operates.
And I mean, there's a huge amount of money, though, that is being spent on compliance and internal audit. So why is this still occurring? Because it's still, I guess, as you said, people are the weakest link, a lack of tracing the data.
Yeah. And there's a question, I think, still around where does fraud risk fall? So compliance will tend, certainly in corporates, but will tend to focus around ABC, sanctions, in some areas AML, but probably not. Fraud, sort of, often it can be the concern of the CFO, but it's not really his budget or her budget to buy the tools to investigate this. Compliance offices are always under-resourced and don't have enough budget, so they're trying to deal with the regulation around them and making sure they're protecting their firm from a regulatory breach. And I think fraud is the one that can tend to fall between the functions, and it doesn't really end up being anybody's responsibility. Internal audit, similarly, often that's on a cycle of governance and reviews of controls. So you could say it should fall into internal audit, but often internal audit doesn't have the same weight that it should do in terms of voice at the table, and again is under-resourced. So to me, that really is one of the main problems, unless you're in a huge organisation or you're in financial services. We have seen financial services appetite for fraud risk assessment increase hugely over the past 3 years or so. Some of that's been regulatory driven, but that has been a notable uptick from the financial services space.
Interesting. So, I mean, if we're looking to the future then, so what do you see as the trends in this field of corporate investigations and compliance overall? And then I guess we could look at the challenges, the trends, and maybe the opportunities.
So I guess a few things. In terms of trends, I mean, it's always hard to predict, because who would have said all of the sanctions issues that have arisen out of Russia, Ukraine? Who would have said COVID? So there will doubtless be endless unexpected issues that come out of the blue, particularly in the geopolitical environment that we're in at the moment. But I think supply chain risk is coming hugely back up the curve again. And particularly with all of the disruption that's happening at the moment, with tariffs, with sanctions, I still don't think many firms there are some good examples, but many firms have got to grips with the risk further down their supply chain. Like their immediate third parties, maybe, but their third parties, and how that can impact them. We're starting to see that being recognised much more, but again, it tends to be more the listed corporates and the big firms that have got big budgets. So I think supply chain is one. What's going to be really interesting is bribery and corruption, with the Trump sort of fallback lightning of FCPA enforcement. It's amazed me how many corporates who really should know better have asked the question, do I not need to worry so much anymore? And the answer is obviously yes. And that's not just me because I work in this space. Like, we all know, of course, you still need to worry. But FCPA, I don't think many have read the small print that enforcement against American companies, not international companies, and that will change again in time. So I do think there will be a fair population of firms that play fast and loose, thinking, oh, it's all okay now. And the ramifications of that in 3, 5, 7 years will be interesting to see. I guess trend-wise, also culture investigations. More and more and more we see when we do work for clients in deal situations, there's always been like an integrity, reputational due diligence question. Now we're being asked much more about the culture of the firm that they're looking to invest in. And I think that is becoming more and more prevalent in terms of what's triggering whistleblower complaints, what's triggering a lot more of that sort of whistleblowing alerts. And I don't think firms really understand the culture of their organisations as they should. I think, unfortunately, tone from the top has just become one of those buzz phrases that is, okay, fine. But really understanding whether there are issues in certain jurisdictions, or even innocently how the hiring of somebody from a culture in those jurisdictions where there's lots of expat business, and hiring someone and putting them in and not allowing or guiding enough on the need to behave differently in the new culture they're operating in. We've seen lots and lots of firms come unstuck in that regard. So those are the trends that I would foresee, and you watch, I'll be completely wrong in 5 years' time.
And I guess some of the challenges as well that you've outlined there. So supply chain, risk, bribery and corruption, culture, obviously several challenges around there, but opportunities as well.
I think there is lots more awareness of how global the world is now. So in terms of deals, we're seeing sort of almost the flow change. So now a lot of the investment is coming from the east into the west. And there's been a whole redirection of capital flows and investment flows. So I think opportunities wise, we talk a lot about the world becoming much more introspective. Actually, that's right in some ways, but in others, I feel like there's a lot more business, like the barriers culturally between business are breaking down massively. And I think there is much more cohesiveness around the way business needs to be conducted, is much more commonly understood across jurisdictions. And hopefully we're losing a bit of that pious West is best culture and being a bit more accepting that all different cultures have something different to bring to the table.
Excellent. Well, I think you've really covered a lot there on the evolving nature of corporate fraud. I think it's a fascinating area. Any other key points that you want to leave our listeners with before we move on to some fun wrap-up questions?
One piece of advice is, in terms of fraud, if you read the business news, and that might sound very, very condescending considering the audience that we're speaking to, but nowadays so much news is consumed on social networks. My understanding of opportunity and risk is frankly by reading the FT every day. It's still the best source to me of proper international understanding of the risks around business and what may be coming down the pike, as opposed to snippets off Twitter and Reddit and all of the others.
Yes, I would support that and say that people should also pay for some news. So whether that's the FT or the Guardian, but you've got to support good investigative and proper journalism.
Completely agree.
Otherwise, we don't know what we're reading and whether it's true either.
Very importantly, but also, most of the really big corporate scandals have been exposed first in the paid for media. And as you say, if that slips away, then where is that channel going to come from?
Yes, totally agree. Okay, so now maybe it's not so much of a fun question, but it's more of a, if you could change anything in our industry, what would it be? So this is you are Queen Zoë for the day. What are you going to change?
I really wish much more attention was paid to how flexible working, in the sense of job sharing, might work. It can't work in every case, but I think for employees with longevity, with real expertise that have worked closely together, to retain people in a difficult industry to work in when you have a family, it's really important that we have men and women. I've seen too many women drop out just because it's too hard to manage the lifestyle that comes with it, with having a family at the same time. And I think it could be managed when you have strong working relationships amongst trusted colleagues, but it isn't explored enough.
Interesting one. Very good. We could have a whole discussion on that. But and what's the next innovation or positive change that you see coming?
In terms of positive change, I think everybody is talking about AI at the moment in the same way that everybody used to talk about data analytics 5 years ago. And it's become just another buzz phrase without most people really understanding what it means or how it might be relevant to them. I think AI, in terms of mining client data quickly, but also preparing some of the basic reports and harnessing data quickly so it can be presented to the client quickly, will drive much more cost efficiency in investigations for clients. I think over time, the cost of investigations got too much. There was too much manual email review, data review. Whereas now, I think clients have become much more savvy because they're aware how the use of AI in how you can mine data that has integrity to drive efficiency will be useful to them. I'm not a great believer still in how our AI is going to change and put us all out of a job, because I think still the data that it's mining in a lot of places is not trustworthy to begin with.
And then finally, we would love your recommendations of a book to read, something to watch, and or a podcast to listen to.
So this is very dated because my TV watching is not highbrow, but I love Billions because it's a lot to the sort of world that we work in. So it's those sort of Netflix shows, unfortunately, that drive most of my viewing as opposed to something highbrow. In terms of podcasts, I don't have a lot of time to listen to podcasts, but the podcast I listen to every single week is The Rest is Politics. Because again, it's so important that we have a international understanding of what's going on in the world, not just a business understanding and not just your jurisdiction. So that gives me the overview, so I know what I need to then dip into quickly to read a bit further.
Excellent. All right. Well, it was a pleasure speaking with you, Zoe, and thank you for joining us. I learnt a lot on what's going on with corporate fraud, and I'm sure our listeners will have as well. And pleasure to speak to you and hope to see you again soon.
You too. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode of Risky Women Radio. Be part of the ongoing conversation and learn more about our events and other programs at riskywomen.org.